There are 3 asset types that I recommend be a part of any kind of content. Today, we're going to talk about them in the context of your podcast. Surprise, surprise. But these are 3 sort of categories of content that are critical for the conversion element of your show. This is where we go above and beyond, sort of throwing a call to action at the end of the episode, all right? Save this one. You're going to revisit this one. You're going to want to take some notes with this one. It's a big one. Let's get into it. Welcome to the More Profitable Podcast with Stacey Harris. I'm Stacey, and this is the spot to learn more about the strategies, tactics, and tools you need to build your more profitable podcast. My team and I work every day with podcasters like you to shift shows from frustrating time sucks to productive members of your sales team, because your show should be built to generate and convert leads. So let's get into it. We talk all the time, you and I, about building a show that generates, educates, and converts right fit clients. What we're going to talk about today is a little bit the educate, but mostly the convert. Because oftentimes we think that educate and convert sit completely separately. That educate is where we teach them about what we do. A great example in this show of strictly education content is the podcast housekeeping series that we run in August, where we, over 4 weeks, work through doing some of the evaluation and the decision-making required from your podcast. The other kind of educate content that you're most often skipping is the education into a sell. And that's what I'm talking about today, where this content lives a little bit in education land, but is really conversion content. As we go through these, I want you to be thinking about how you can do this in your own show. So we're going to talk about each of these categories. I'm going to give you an idea of what they look like. Might even share some examples. This is the place to start when you sit down and you're mapping out your quarter, because that's what you do, right? Every quarter, you sit down. We do it with our production clients, the last month of the current quarter, and we sit down and we map out the next quarter. Whenever that works for you, though, you're going to be mapping out 12 weeks of content at a time. This is how we structure our podcast strategy intensives, which, by the way, we're filling up summer spots now. So head on over to uncommonlymore.com/intensive. If as we're moving through today's episode, you're like, these are great, I don't know what that looks like. And you get that sort of overwhelmed feeling in your chest. I get it. If that happens, this is the work we do in podcast strategy intensives, is building out your content plan for 12 weeks with assets that include episodes like these 3 sort of categories we're going to talk about today. Okay? Again, uncommonlymore.com/intensive. We are filling up for the summer right now. It's awesome and exciting, but also if you want to do this summer, let's do it. And by the by, summer's a really good time to do it, because this is how we hit fall and that like new school Pavlovian energy that we have just from years of indoctrination in the time structures of our culture. That's a thing for another day, right? But that newness that happens in the fall, that fresh start, that also, like, we're careening towards the end of the year, and what did I do this year, and am I going to reach my goals? I don't want to be also under the gun to create content. I mean, for us, a little peek behind the scenes here, I'm going to overshare. When we come back from our summer break, we'll go into full-on launch mode for the Profitable Podcaster Mastermind. That's when our last round for the year will be. We'll kick off for September, October, November, which means in August, we will be selling it. And so I'm going to be coming right back in, and still technically the end of summer, going into a launch mode. If I wanted to fill a program for the fall, and I wasn't thinking about what my content was going to look like in the fall this summer, I would be running into a planned launch, a launch I planned, honestly, this time last year with no prep. This is why launches are stressful. It's because we don't give ourselves runway. So if there's something you're looking at launching this fall, if there's something that you know you want to be doing in that last quarter of the year, or even in this last half of the year, with your clients, with your offers, with your podcast, now is the time for us to be doing that planning. Now is the time for us to be doing that creation. So head on over to uncommonlymore.com/intensive and let's sit down. Let's book this in for you and let's get this figured out so that whatever it is that you want to create in Q4 is set up for success starting now. That is the fastest way to give yourself some space in what feels like a never-ending loop of content creation. I know it. I feel it too. All right. I'm putting my prep and planning soapbox away because I'll just assume that you have paused the show, headed over to uncommonlymore.com/intensive, submitted your application, booked time to have a conversation with me, and now you're back. And so welcome back. Let's get into this. The first one I want to talk about is probably our most education-y episode. And frankly, this episode is a version of it. These are the episodes where we educate, but in a way that helps our listener really sort of assess their own readiness. Really assess if it's the right time for them. Because if as we're having this conversation and as we're going through this episode and I'm talking about some of these elements and you are like, oh, well, I don't have those, then you're going to be able to identify you're not ready. On the flip side, if as we're going through this episode and what is much more common, you go, oh yeah, I'm going to get real meta here today. Is that cool with you? You're real meta. When I just did that call to action, this feels very counterproductive. But anyways, when I just did the call to action for the podcast strategy intensive, as I was talking through things like if you've got a launch coming up this fall, whatever, these are moments that I call nod along moments. These are moments where I'm creating an experience, language for you to nod along with. And so in a self-assessment of readiness kind of episode, we're going to want to have a lot of those nod along moments. So as you're looking at your next 3 months, do you have content, or honestly, why don't we audit your last 3 months? If you're looking at your last 3 months and you don't have any episodes where there's an opportunity for your listener to go, ooh, that's me. Ooh, they get it. Oh yeah, I felt that. Any of those kind of moments, it's time for you to prioritize these. Because these are, again, where we sit sort of the most education, but we need these to set up the conversion. I will link some other examples in the show notes of where we've got episodes like this, but really, again, we're going to get super meta and transparent here, but a lot of when I educate is this. Because I'll mention having programs. I'll mention having been in your show for a while. I'll mention using your show as a way to get clients. I'll mention things like when you get on a sales call and you hear somebody sort of parroting your podcast back to you. These are those nod along moments. And now that you've heard me say this, by the way, you're going to really recognize them when I use them. But that's good. They'll help you understand context in which you can feed them into your own show. Again, this is where it gets kind of weird because I do the things that I'm sort of teaching you to do. And so I'm like, you're going to know all the tricks. But it's not tricks. It is where we use our podcast as a funnel, right? And when we're using our podcast as such an important part of our funnel, we've got to be mindful of these elements that have to be there for this to work. These elements that have to be there for this to make sense to the listener as a progression. And it's not going to be something they're conscious of. It's going to be something that they feel. It's going to be something that they can understand. They can feel the relationship, the understanding that the relationship has grown and is growing. And these nod along moments, these self-assessment of readiness kind of episodes, these elements of your content are a really important part of them becoming conscious to those moments. And so highlighting where you are creating opportunities for your listener to feel connected and like this is a place for them. Not in a I feel seen and safe way, although that's important too, but in a they get what I'm talking about. They get what's in my head that maybe I'm afraid to verbalize. This is a huge one when we're looking for them to self-assess their readiness. When we can start saying the things that they're only saying in their heads. that they've not yet felt comfortable saying out loud. And a lot of where I pull this from is sales calls conversations, honestly. I mentioned a while back at some point, one of my favorite tools to use is Fathom as a note taker for my recordings. Because ADHD and I will forget and I can search it and it's great, but also to pull language. And so when I'm in a sales call, maybe even more so now that I'm thinking about it, when I'm in that kickoff call, that first call where they sign, that's where ish gets real, right? That's where we start to really see what's happening here. The glamour of our first date has passed and we're seeing all the bumps and bruises. And we're really starting to hear where the discomfort is, where the frustration is. And so that's where I'm pulling a lot of this from often is where can I say these things that they're maybe not even ready to admit to themselves, much less anyone on their team, anyone who they've brought in for support, like a coach or a consultant or even a mastermind partner. Where can I start saying those things to them? Because those nod along moments are how they start to understand their readiness and understand the fit. All right. Again, in the show notes, I'll have some examples of these episodes. I want to shift now into the next one, which is again, partially educational, partially conversion. This is another place where we're teaching them, but we're educating them very differently because we're educating them about what's next. And that's our audio sales pages. These are where we're setting expectations. This is where we're saying, honestly, for my clients, most often answering the question, what's going to be expected of me? And maybe that resonates for you as something too, but I think so often as service providers, especially where we're offering a high-end or luxury or a high-touch experience, however you want to phrase that, it's imperative that we make it clear how much, or frankly, often how little our clients are actually going to need to show up in the container. Because I think oftentimes one of two things happens. For service providers where we're selling, when I think about like my production clients, where we're selling a high touch service, done for you service, oftentimes there's a belief that a lot more of them will be required than is actually there. On the flip side, when I'm talking about selling a program like the Profitable Podcaster Mastermind, or honestly, even the Podcast Strategy Intensive, sometimes there's a belief that a lot less will be required from them than really is. Because I'm not doing anything for you in those two offers. I guess in the intensive, maybe the intensive sort of sits in the middle of this spectrum because I am doing the audit for you and we're building it together more. But certainly when you're somebody who's selling a group program or courses or something where it's really imperative that the client show up to get results, because purchasing a course has changed nobody's life or business. It always requires that next step of, doing it. And this education around what's actually going to be required from them can be a deal breaker, frankly, the lack of clarity around it. Because oftentimes, again, they're making up too much or they're making up not enough as far as what's going to be required from them in the working relationship. And I think that's one of the most important parts of the audio sales pages as we've built them out in our own content and as we've partnered with our clients to build them out, is it helps set expectations. This will be my job. This will be your job. This will be what happens. Also, in an era of I don't really know if so-and-so knows what they're talking about, being really transparent about what happens once you're hired as a customer, knowing that you know what comes next is strangely a differentiator. Is far too often a differentiator. And I'm sure right now in that moment, an experience popped into your head where you're like, yeah, it would have been great if I realized they had no idea what was happening next. And I'm not talking about those of us who have sold a course and sort of built the content as we go, because you still go into it with a firm understanding of here is the deliverable. This is what you're getting. I'm just actually like recording the videos and things like that in the process. I love to create content like that. The Profitable Podcaster Mastermind was built that way. I sold it and then we built it as I was delivering it. And now, frankly, because of the nature of that program, it kind of gets built every time because it is curated for the group that's in it. But What I think is so valuable here is this is where I want your proving how smart I am energy to go. So often, this effort to prove you know what you're talking about comes in the form of how-to content that's never going to actually be utilized. And instead, I want you to be looking at what is the how-to content that is how to work with me, how to get results from this course or program. And that's an audio sales page, babe. That is setting expectations. Here's what's going to happen. Here's what's inside. Often, and for high touch services, like if you go listen to the What Working with Uncommonly More looks like, which is one of the example episodes I will put in the show notes, we go from the moment you send in your application. Like we take you behind the scenes of the sales process. Here's what a sales call with me is going to be like. And we've helped clients build exactly that kind of episode. Here's what happens on a sales call. Because often the not knowing is what keeps someone inactive. It's what keeps someone from taking the step because they will build a picture in their mind that is not accurate, often based off of poor actual real life experiences, because we all know not everybody's as cool as us. We've worked with the clients after they've worked with the people who are not as cool with us. I know that personally. It's one of the reasons some of these assets exist is because I wanted people to have an opportunity to see we really do know what we're talking about. We really do know what we're building it. And it's not by me proving how smart I am. It's by me proving to you and showing you and being really transparent about what's going to happen next and then delivering on it just consistently. There's no faster way to prove how smart you are than to be honest and transparent about what happens next. Because the person who can't really tell you what's going to happen after you purchase, they do not have enough experience to deliver. They just don't. And again, I'm differentiating. I'm filming and creating content in a program as I roll it out. That sits separately for me. Again, that's something I do as well because I do know what I'm delivering. I just haven't filmed the content yet. And that's because the nuance, the smaller points often come from what's asked. Honestly, there's really no better example of this than the Profitable Podcaster Mastermind because the structure of those calls changed after that first round. And frankly, in that first round, I had gone into that with a slightly different use for the second call where we do our co-working call. It was going to be me not really talking. It was going to be just the space to get stuff done. And I ended up turning that into essentially a coaching call on that month's topics because there would be questions and they were helpful for everyone. And so there was no reason to put them somewhere quiet. They didn't need to go into a Facebook group and only ask questions there and then we co-work inside. No. And so it evolved based on the needs of the group. I wouldn't have known that until we did it. And if I had had content created for a second call, I would have completely overwhelmed the students in that first round. And so I'm not talking about situations where we're building something like workbooks and recording videos in a course. I'm talking specifically about a lack of clarity around the bullet points that are going to be delivered, especially when we're talking about a service relationship, especially when we're talking about like I'm going into a year-long coaching contract or I'm going into a virtual assistant or fractional COO or fractional CFO or, any of these kind of like high level strategic done for you kind of services. I need you to be able to tell me what's going to happen next. Because if you can't, you do not have enough of a system that's going to help me get where I need to go. And so think about that when you're talking about this audio sales page. And I've got a whole episode where we dig even deeper into this whole audio sales page thing. And I will make sure it is linked in the show notes as well. Man, this is going to be like a whole landing page of different episodes to go listen to. Let's wrap this up because we're getting to hit the 20-minute mark here. The last one is much like our second one, a little bit education, but really mostly conversion. And that's the social proof element. That's the case study of it all. I will link some examples. Our most recent one, we had Nicole Achi on the show, and we talked about what working with us in honestly, every way is because Nicole is somebody who has worked with us and just about it. Maybe every offer we've had. She's done an intensive with me. She's done the Profitable Podcaster Mastermind, and now she is a production client. And that episode is such a great example of what it looks like to bring a client on so that my prospects, folks like you, can hear from someone in their seat and not just somebody in my seat. And there's a lot of education there just because specifically in that episode, Nicole drops a whole bunch of value. Another great example of this is Andrea Libros, who I sat down with when her She Thinks Big book came out, which was so exciting. Earlier this year, late last year, I can't remember. I'll link the episode in the show notes. But we talked about using the podcast as part of her book process. And so there's a ton of value in there. But there's also a lot of assessing readiness, of understanding what working with us looks like, of getting a feel for who our clients are so that you can see yourselves in them. So notice how, now that we've sort of gone through all three of them, and again, I'll put episodes on social proof, some examples in the show notes, and we actually may have an example, or rather an episode, where I dig into case studies more deeply. If we do, I'll put that in the show notes as well. And if we don't, I'll put it on the editorial calendar. But what I want you to notice as we've gone through all three of these is there are pieces where there's crossover, right? So as we talk through the social proof episode, it's going to become really clear how these social proof episodes help assess readiness, help set expectations like an audio sales page. And that's why I wanted to talk about this one last, because these are the episodes where you can be pointing to those other two assets so that you're really tying a ribbon and bringing these elements together. So when you have somebody who becomes a absolute binge listener, who gets a referral or who finds a social post or who finds an episode of you answering a specific question, they can really go through a really nice little rabbit hole here, an intentional rabbit hole. These are also, when we're talking about being in a launch period, things we want to be tying together as we look at setting up a launch. I want to make sure I've got these things where somebody can be assessing their own readiness, somebody can be getting really clear on setting expectations on what this offer is and isn't, because that's important too, and then can be reassured that this is for or not for them based on hearing from somebody who's been through it. And that's where I want you to get really clear is how can you be tying these together? Do you have any of them? If you don't, where do we need to plug holes? If you do, are you doing a good job of using them in coordination? Are you doing a good job of supporting them with each other? And so as you go through a social proof episode, as you go through a case study, it needs to be walking the listener through the experience of where were they, the decision-making process to work with you, what working with you has actually looked like, and what's happening now that they have worked with you. And I'm not saying on the other side, because, certainly in my case, every single case study that I've had on this show is still a client. And so we're not on the other side. We're still in that work. So, and I point this out because so often I hear from podcasters that they can't do that because they're in long-term contracts. And so those clients are still active clients. Why would they do a case study? They're not done working with me yet. While they're working with you is totally okay. It's great. Rock and roll. Get whatever it needs to be to get it done. Whatever it needs to be so that you can be giving your listeners an honest experience of what this looks like. Because that's where they're going to see themselves, and that's where they're going to really see your impact and what's possible. All right? If as we listen to this, as we went through this, you were like, I don't have any of that. I need it. Let's do it. Podcast Strategy Intensive is your first starting point. Head on over to uncommonlymore.com/intensive. Let's get this set up for you. Let's build out your 12-week content plan. The other great benefit of that is I'm going to do an audit. So we'll talk all through this on the sales call, because when you go to intensive, uncommonlymore.com/intensive, you'll submit an application, answer some questions. Really, it's just so that I can prepare for our conversation and book a call with me. On that call, you and I will get clear on what you've got now, and more importantly, how we want to prioritize the use of that intensive, whether that be fleshing out like outlines and getting really deep into specific episodes for an upcoming launch, or if it's building up 12 weeks of content and figuring out how can we repurpose as much as we can from what you've been creating so that you can start creating these assets for a launch you're going to do this fall. These are things we have done in the last couple of weeks on podcast strategy intensives, by the way. We can figure that out in our initial 30-minute conversation so that we can hit the ground running. It will also help prioritize what I'm looking for in your audit when I do your audit before our call. All right? Head on over to uncommonlymore.com/intensive. Book that conversation with me. Let's have a chat. It's going to be good. I can't wait. I'll see you there. Thanks so much for listening to the show. Remember that content consumption does not make changes. So commit to doing something from today's episode. Maybe it's taking action on what we talked about. Maybe it's reaching out to me and learning more about podcast strategy intensives or what podcast production looks like with our team. All of that is over at uncommonlymore.com. And if you haven't yet signed up for the podcast newsroom, I want to remind you that is a great next step. If you're not really sure what comes next, hang out over there. Get those exclusive private episodes. That's over at podcastnewsroom.com. And the last favor I will ask, because social proof is endlessly important for sure, is to leave a rating or review for the show. If you go to ratethispodcast.com/more, that's the easiest way to do it. But I would love to hear what you thought of the show, what you think of the show, and if the show has been helpful for you. I can't wait to chat with you. So this is just the start of the conversation. Reach out so we can keep it going. Talk soon.